All right, hi everybody. Thanks for coming out today. My name is Jeffrey Veidlinger, and I am the director of the Raoul Wallenberg Institute here at the University of Michigan. And really happy to have you all here for this afternoon's Samantha Woll Dialogue on the topic of why do monuments matter? Thank you, everybody, for joining us. Thanks to the faculty, fellows, alumni, visitors, and particularly all of the students who are here. We really appreciate you being here. And thanks to the staff of the Wallenberg Institute for setting this all up. Joe Johnson, who's outside there, Miriam Mora, and Eleanor Camp, who's right over there. And thank you as well to the family of Samantha Woll, Margot and Doug Woll, Monica and Ben Rosen, for making this series possible. Samantha Woll, after whom the series was named, was a proud graduate of the University of Michigan, a passionate community leader and a committed grassroots organizer, spearheading advocacy programs and events focused on women's rights, fair trade, labor rights, civil rights, refugee rights, the State of Israel, and more. During her time at Michigan, Sam served in the Michigan Student Assembly, contributed to the Michigan Daily, and represented students as the university's delegate to the Ann Arbor City Council. Her greatest impact, however, was felt through her unwavering dedication to building bridges across religious, ethnic, political, and community groups. In October 2023, at the age of 40, Sam was tragically murdered in Detroit. At the time of her passing, she was serving as the president of the Isaac Agree Downtown Synagogue, a revitalized Jewish congregation in the heart of Detroit. Sam's influence, however, extended well beyond her own faith. She used her remarkable ability to listen and to unite individuals of diverse backgrounds and beliefs when she founded the Muslim Jewish Forum of Detroit in 2015. Part of the Raoul Wallenberg Institute's public programming, the Samantha Woll Dialogues address difficult topics suitable to the challenges of our era, with an emphasis on the Wallenberg's mission of studying and combating ethnic and religious hatred, fostering cross-cultural understanding, elevating civil discourse, and developing strategies to fight anti-Semitism, divisiveness, and discrimination. Universities, and particularly public universities like our own, have unique roles to fulfill not only in educating and empowering the next generation, but also in serving as a marketplace of ideas where diverse viewpoints and perspectives can be freely expressed, evaluated, and critiqued. In facilitating this type of discussion, we can unite as a community in pursuit of knowledge and a better world. I want to mention that you all will have index cards, or will come around. Eleanor will actually come around with index cards in about half an hour, in which you can write down questions that she will then bring to me to help guide the latter part of our discussion. So you can start thinking about what you would put on those questions, on those cards. And now I'd like to introduce our two panelists for the afternoon. First, Erin Thompson, to my immediate left, is the author of Smashing Statues, The Rise and Fall of American Public Monuments. She teaches at John Jay College of the City University of New York. Holding a PhD in art history and a law degree, she studies the deliberate destruction of art, analyzing the ways in which this destruction has sometimes harmed and sometimes benefited communities. She's spoken about monument controversies with outlets including The New Yorker, The New York Times, C-SPAN, and most impressively, The Today Show, and both Stephen Colbert and John Oliver have referenced her work. Dr. Anoush Tamar Suni, to her left, is a sociocultural anthropologist who studies political violence and the aftermath of genocide, the politics of history and memory, ruins, landscape, and cultural heritage, as well as religious and ethnic minority communities in the Middle East. Dr. Suni is currently a postdoctoral research fellow here at the Raoul Wallenberg Institute, where she's completing her first book, Memory in Ruins, Politics of History and the Afterlives of Genocide in Anatolia. And now I will join them. Is the microphone working? Yeah. Right, now I will join them and begin our discussion by maybe posing the first general question. Can you hear me? Yeah? What do you think? Okay, whatever. So posing the first question, why don't you tell us a little bit about how you got to the topic of monuments and memory? And we'll start with you, Erin.
I wrote this book about monuments because my girlfriend makes really good cocktails. So in August of 2020, it was a nice evening. She made a cocktail, I drank it, then I drank another one, and then I opened my laptop and went on Twitter, which is not a good idea. You should not drink and tweet. But I saw a video of someone throwing a rope around the neck of a statue of Columbus in St. Paul, Minneapolis, and I retweeted it with something like, as a professor who studies the deliberate destruction of cultural monuments, let me just say next time use a chain instead of a rope and it'll go faster. So that went viral. And I was even, Tucker Carlson devoted a section of his show to denouncing me. He said I was a nihilist who leads armies of students or whatever to rip down monuments, which is funny because the closest thing I know to a nihilist are my own children, and they don't even listen to me about bedtime. So the idea that I'm leading anybody to do anything. But what was interesting to me was that in the comments, there are thousands of comments on this post, and people were asking questions like, oh, isn't taking down monuments uncivilized? Civilized people don't do that. And I'm an art historian who studies ancient Greek and Roman and ancient Near Eastern things. So every monument that I work on was ripped down at some point and thrown into a pit, and that's why we still could dig it up later and look at it. So I thought, I know the answer to that question. No. It is, in fact, a very human thing to take down monuments. We started doing it basically the 20 minutes after we put them up. So I can answer that question, and that's what started me on writing this book.
Anoush, want to answer the same question? How did you get to the topic?
Yeah, so I'm a sociocultural anthropologist, as Jeff mentioned, and the monuments that I study are not the monuments we think of. I think when we think of monuments, they're not, men on horseback in a city square. I study the ruins of Armenian medieval churches and monasteries that are left over after the genocide of Ottoman Armenians in southeastern Turkey. And so there are these monumental ruined structures in the middle of a village or on a mountaintop. And similarly, I also didn't set out to study this. It's I found my way there by accident, more or less. I grew up here, actually, in Ann Arbor, Michigan, and I was interested in Middle East history and languages and music, and I found my way to Turkey in 2010 after I graduated from college. And my mother, she had insisted that I go to southeastern Turkey to see where her grandparents had been born and from which they emigrated to the US. They were Armenian and they lived there until 1905. So I went to Van, as a heritage tourist, trying to see where my ancestors had come from, knowing very little about the history other than that Armenians had lived there until the genocide of 1915, and then the Ottoman Turkish government destroyed that community, and after 1923, the Republic of Turkey was founded as an ethno-national Turkish state. And so that's all I knew. And so when I got there to Van, I was shocked to see that not only is it, it is Turkey, there are Turkish flags everywhere, and there are these ruins and remnants of the Armenian community, but it's also a major Kurdish city. There are, people speaking Kurdish on the street. There's a majority Kurdish population, and that was the first time that I learned about the Kurdish struggle for independence or autonomy. And so being there in that place in 2010 awakened all these questions in my mind. So if this is Turkey and the national language is Turkish and there are all these Turkish flags, but there are Kurdish civilians on the ground who are fighting for their own autonomy and rights, and then there are these massive, monumental, huge ruins of Armenian churches, but no Armenians around anymore, what is the role of these monuments? What are these churches doing here? Why are they still here? What are their afterlives since 1915 and the genocide? And what kinds of roles do they play in public memory? So that's what set me off on this journey, which has now gone on for basically 16 years. And here we are.
Yeah, and it's fascinating how you both look at monuments, but different types of monuments in, of course, different parts of the world, whether they're statues that are actually designed to be monuments or churches that are designed for other purposes but then become monuments. I want to turn for next question. I want to turn to the topic of our dialogue today, which is why do monuments matter? But it occurs to me to ask you something first, which is, do monuments matter? So maybe I'll ask, do monuments matter? And you can add into that why they matter in answering the questions. Maybe we'll go back to Erin.
Well, sometimes I think they do, sometimes I think they don't. And whenever I'm trying to talk to my children about monuments, it doesn't matter to them. But I think monuments, it remains a question. What is this for? What was it for when it was made? How is it historically used? What is it useful for now? And what can it be useful for in the future? And this is especially an important set of questions to ask when we're thinking, as we are now, about monumental change. Should we retain what we have? Should we get new monuments? A lot of the debate we've seen over the last few years has focused on the character of the people represented. So who's the man on the horse? Do we like him or not? I think this doesn't matter so much because nobody's perfect, except maybe Harriet Tubman, which is why there's so many Harriet Tubman monuments. But you have to ask, what is the monument doing versus just who was the person honored? What are we honoring them for? And so you can look at, say, the dedication speeches when this monument was put up. Why was it done? What was the goal? I have a chapter on the Birmingham Confederate Monument, which is a strange monument to begin with because the city of Birmingham, Alabama, wasn't founded until well after the close of the Civil War. So no citizen of Birmingham fought in the Civil War because they weren't around yet. And when you look at the monument, it went up in 2 stages. First the base, and then a few years later, it was an obelisk, so the shaft of the monument went up. Both of those were in response to threatened interracial unionization efforts of mine workers who were going to strike for better working conditions. And the newspapers printed the dedication speeches in full, and when we're talking full, it was early 20th century. They could really go on and on and on. And all of those speeches were addressing the white workers in the audiences, saying you need to keep fighting for what your forefathers fought for, your fathers, your grandfathers, against one of the quotes was, against the hideous specter of threatened racial equality. So it was very clear what that monument was doing then. But does that mean that a monument has the same meaning today? Not necessarily. We can look at, for example, the Lincoln Memorial in DC, which when it went up, the dedication ceremonies were segregated. But it has become, over history, was used as the backdrop, the focal point of protest marches, of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. speaking, incredible events that now I think it symbolizes fights for civil rights in a way that it very definitely was not built or inaugurated to do. So the question of why monuments matter, do monuments matter, I think changes a lot.
Yeah. So do monuments matter and why do monuments matter? I was thinking about this today, what do monuments matter and why do they matter? And the answer that came to my mind is monuments matter because they are matter, which I think came to us when we were putting together the title of this a year ago. Monuments matter because they are material and because they are materializations of the history that whoever is putting them up is trying to disseminate. And so, for instance, in Turkey, when we think about the kinds of monuments that are put up in public spaces by the government, they are monuments that are very specific representations of an ethno-national Turkish history that leave out or conceal any kind of minority histories. And then those that fight against those kind of monuments, they may be trying to bring in some other kind of history that's not part of that monument. So they matter because they are physical, concrete, stone manifestations of a specific representation of history and in the public eye. They're not, a history book that someone might or might not read. There's something that people can see constantly going to and from school or work, but at the same time, they often recede into the background. So there may be monuments. I was trying to think, what monuments do I see here on U of M campus on a day-to-day basis? And I can't even recall some of the details because you just walk by them when you're doing other things. But thinking about an example like the Birmingham monument that you mentioned, I was thinking what monument from my field site would represent this, how monuments become sites of contest over history. And one example came to mind. There's a village in Van, in my field site, called Khorkom in Armenian, which was an Armenian village 100 years ago, and it was the birthplace of Arshil Gorky, who was born there and then emigrated to the US and became a famous painter. And so it's famous for Armenians because of Arshil Gorky's birthplace. And I went there in 2010 to see, where Arshil Gorky was born, because it's an important site. And I knew that there was a church there because, it's written in the history books that there was a monastery and a church. When I went, I asked local Kurdish folks, where's the church? And they told me that a local man had torn down the church and used it to build his house, but that the local imam had warned him not to do that because it's a holy site, and he did it anyway. And shortly afterwards, his whole family became ill, and some of them died, and the villagers, they all know that this is because he destroyed the church. So this was the first story that I heard about Khorkom. And later, in 2015, the local municipality the elections were won by the Kurdish Party, which is a pluralistic democratic party that is trying to bring in these minority histories like Armenian histories and Kurdish histories. And so they set out to build a memorial fountain, a monument, in memory of Arshil Gorky, this Armenian who was born in that village. And so they did this. They built a fountain over a natural spring, and they put up a plaque that had his biography in English, Armenian, Kurdish, and Turkish. And they wrote on the sides of the fountain, Gorky Fountain, in all 4 languages. And I was very excited about this. I thought this is a remarkable monument in a place where, a nationalist homogenizing history is the norm. For this local Kurdish municipality to create this monument to an Armenian resident and someone born in this village. So I went to go see it, and I was surprised to see that in Kurdish, where they had written Gorky Fountain, they had written Kani Gorky, which in Kurdish it should be Kania Gorky, which would mean the fountain of Gorky. But a lot of the Kurds in Turkey haven't had sort of like literary training in Kurdish because you can't, it's illegal. And so they wrote what they could figure out. But if you say Kani Gorky in Kurdish, it means where is Gorky? Because Kani can mean fountain or where. And I thought that was amazing, because here's this memorial fountain memorializing this Armenian who was born here, but it's also asking this question, where is Gorky? Where are the Armenians? What happened to them? And it's so in multivalent ways, it's asking this question. And then the last part of the story is in 2016, during a re-emergence of the conflict between the PKK, the Kurdish Workers' Party, and the Turkish government, the government of Turkey imprisoned a number of Kurdish mayors in the area, and they put appointed Turkish government officials in their places. And that new appointee in 2016 removed all the signs from this memorial fountain, removed all of the words around the fountain, and took the faucets off. You can't even, so it's no longer even a fountain. It's now sort of an unmarked, structure. And so this monument really represented for me the conflict over both the historical narrative, who gets to memorialize the history of a place, who gets to mark that place, and who gets to write the history. So that was an example of that.
And who gets to become unnoticeable, right? I think monuments so often have the privilege of boringness, of fading into the background, of being taken for granted. And that's their goal, I think, is often like, this is the state of affairs that we just don't question. And everybody is going to pass it every day and have it imprinted in their brain somewhere, but not consciously address it.
Anoush, your story reminds me actually of my own work on when I was interviewing elderly Yiddish speakers in Ukraine and traveling through Ukraine and having them show us murder sites from World War II, which are often in forests a little bit. And it was politically very difficult to put up a monument to these massacre sites where thousands of bodies are in the forest. So a lot of people would have some strategies to put them up. Sometimes they would put up an obelisk or just scribble on a rock in Yiddish what had taken place there. And again, often in grammatically incorrect Yiddish and with some incorrect phrases in there, or they would use the wrong biblical phrases to refer if they were trying to write in Hebrew. So similar types of very makeshift memorials. And then those were the ones deep in the forest that nobody knew where they were. You had to have somebody show you where they were. And even when we were traveling there, we would find locals who would take us there. And you could go deep into the forest, sometimes 10-minute walk into through dense forest, where there would be this monument that had been erected at a site of mass murder. So similar types of experience. There were also instances where massacres had taken place closer to towns, and it wasn't politically expedient to put up any type of monument marking it. So they had done things like plant a grove of trees over the site of the mass murder so that nothing could be built there in its place. So I know there's all types of strategies of memorializing, and of course, in Ukraine, where I was working, there were all types of debates over what those monuments should say exactly and what the wording on them should say and how they've been appropriated by different groups. So maybe I'll kind of turn that on you and ask you, I know that you talk about palimpsests a lot and about the way that monuments and sites are reappropriated by different communities. So maybe I'll ask you to talk a little bit about that process, a little bit more about that process, and then I'll ask Erin the same question.
Absolutely. How monuments, so in many instances, we have these kind of state created monuments, and they're put there by the government to tell the appropriate government sanctioned story. But then oftentimes these kinds of monuments can also become sites for reinterpretation or sites for resisting these narratives in ways that are not always anticipated. So I have a number of examples, but I'll tell you one which I think was one that it happened very early on, also in 2010, on one of my earliest trips to Turkey, in which I went with sort of a blank slate, didn't know what to expect, was very naive, wandered into all kinds of situations I wouldn't now put myself in, but which led me into many realizations about the history and the politics and the points of tension. So in a province in Turkey called Iğdır, which is north of Van, but right on the border with Armenia, there is a replica of Noah's Ark. And I actually went to see that because a local guide had said, there's a replica of Noah's Ark and you can see Mount Ararat behind it. It's a great photo opportunity. And so, I found myself there. I didn't have a smartphone. There were no Google Maps. So I didn't, we're sort of wandering around with the local guide and another American friend. And we found the Noah's Ark, which was really not that big. It wasn't even big enough to fit like one elephant, let alone more than one. And we're taking photos, and then I turn around, there's really nothing there. It's empty fields. I turn around, and behind me, I realize, wait a minute, there's this huge thing. What is this? There was a 43-meter high monument, which was 4 swords pointing up in the air, obviously very militaristic, nationalistic. And I thought, what is it? It's on a mound. So we go up and look closer, and on the base of the swords, there are highly militaristic Turkish nationalist symbols. Wolves, men in medieval Central Asian Turkic military garb, and Turkish flag symbols. So it's obviously a Turkish nationalist monument. And it's on the border with Armenia. Later I realized it's that big because they want it to be visible from Armenia. They want the Armenians on the Armenian side to see this huge sword monument. So we wander down below, and we see the entrance of this mound is actually a museum. And it has a sign on it that says, the museum in memory of the Armenian genocide of Turks. So it's a memorial museum memorializing a genocide that Armenians supposedly carried out against Turks in 1915. So it's a totally false, mythologized victim narrative. And it was locked. But I was curious, so I'm poking around, and there was a groundskeeper there. And he saw me, and he said, oh, you want to see the museum? I'll let you in. He let me in, me and my American friend who didn't know Turkish, and I was just learning Turkish. So we're in there, and I'm sort of surreptitiously taking photos of the displays of supposed weapons that Armenians supposedly used to kill, carry out a genocide against Turks. And after a couple of minutes, the groundskeeper comes back, and I put my camera away because I thought, I don't think he's going to want me to be taking pictures. But he knew we were foreign, and he said, do you know what this history is about? And I said, no, I don't know anything. I'm just, just don't know anything, totally innocent and naive here, just curious, just American. I'm not Armenian for sure. And he said, well, this is all a lie. Let me tell you what actually happened. I'm Kurdish, and what actually happened is that 100 years ago, the Turkish government, they came and they said to the Kurds, kill the Armenians and take their property. And I was, shocked that the groundskeeper of the museum was telling me this, saying it's all a facade. And I said, well, could you repeat that again, please? Because I was just learning Turkish, so I wanted to make sure I understood. And he said, okay, look, let's say, your friend is the Armenians, you're the Kurds, and I'm the Turkish government. So I come to you and I say, kill him and you can have his house. So you kill him, you take your house. Then I come and I kill you and I take your house. And this is what happened. First, the Kurds, the Turkish government, the Ottoman government, they instrumentalized the Kurds. They used them to do their dirty work and kill the Armenians. And then, after that, then they turned on the Kurds. And this was a narrative I heard over and over and over during my fieldwork, this kind of idea of this parallel victimhood or this layering or cycles of violence, these palimpsests of violence. But inside this museum that was created specifically to disseminate this government view of history. And I thought that was so interesting how even in these very nationalist spaces, these curated museum spaces, these alternative histories and narratives can come through.
Thankfully, in America, all our monuments only tell true stories. Erin, you want to comment maybe on how how monuments have been used by different communities?
Well, your story reminds me of a sort of opposite story, which is that last year I went to Washington and Lee University, which was renamed from Washington University to Washington and Lee after Robert E. Lee, Commander-in-Chief of the Confederate Forces, took on its presidency after the war. And then when he was buried, they made the main building on campus was church, was renamed Memorial Chapel with a big statue of him reclined on a bier, and it became a place of pilgrimage for sort of Confederate heritage folks. And in the last few years, the administration of the college has done a really interesting job trying not to deny that history. They think it's not right to just remove it. And Lee himself is in fact buried in the chapel now, so you can't just turf him out. But they wanted to keep the history with removing the honorific sort of deification of Lee. So they've rearranged a lot of things. Now, instead of, it used to be that this statue was just visible at all times. Now they've sort of installed a wall, so you have to specifically enter the space instead of just for every school assembly, lots of signage, lots of education. But when I went there, the volunteers who were working there were like, oh, don't forget to go visit Old Traveler on your way out, because they also have Lee's horse buried out in back of the chapel. People leave sugar cubes for the horse, also pennies upside down, so that Lincoln's face is in the dirt over the horse, yes. And there's a number of interactions like this, and then I was talking to the administrators, and they're like, oh, we've trained them not to do that. So people will stick to their own way of interacting with and encouraging other people to interact with the monuments, even when you attempt to change it. But I love monument changes. Kristen Hess, who is a professor here at Michigan and is in the audience today, wrote a wonderful book called Blunt Instruments about monuments, and tells the story of a portrait statue of Strom Thurmond, which has an inscription saying that he's the father of 4 children, and then his illegitimate daughter, who's mixed race, protested that she's not one of the listed, so they changed the monument. Now it says there's an awkwardly inserted 5. So sometimes monuments do change, but writing this book, I realized how resistant to making visible the process of change we are in America. We don't like our monuments to look like they're in flux. to look like they're questioned. It's either there or it's down. So in the summer of 2020, there's all these incredible projections and modifications and additional sculptures. Those disappeared as quickly as possible. I think the authorities don't like to have this anti-authoritarian approach to monuments. And even, so the man whose video I saw of him throwing the rope around the statue of Columbus, his name is Mike Forcha. He's an indigenous activist in the Twin Cities, and I eventually got to interview him to ask him what he was wanting to do in that moment. And he explained that he didn't really want to remove the statue at all. He had been trying for his entire adult life, for over 20 years, to have a process of questioning the statue. To have public discussions about the statue, but all of his petitions went nowhere. There's no process of even having an official discussion. But he wanted that history to be there. You know, why is the city with the largest urban indigenous population in America having a statue of someone who certainly never set foot in Minnesota up there, who's remembered as the cause of genocide. But if the only alternatives was to have that statue there unquestioned or to have it removed, he sort of reluctantly thought, all right, let's remove it. But having a modification would, I think, be much more welcome by a lot of the people who are working on monuments change. But in America, we are seemingly incapable of having this be the official position.
Well, actually, maybe first I'll ask Eleanor if you want to start collecting or handing out index cards, see if people have questions. And maybe I'll turn to the issue of smashing statues, what you do, how we deal with them when they become out of date, when people have problems with them, what the proper solution is. Maybe if we can talk about that a little bit. I know, in America there's been the 3 waves in the last few years. In 2015, I guess, after the Dylann Roof shooting in Charleston, and then after Charlottesville, and then after George Floyd, were the 3 instances in which there were waves of trying to get rid of monuments. And there's also been movements to rebrand monuments, to change their writing, to change the descriptions, the national parks, which I understand has now been reverted. Yes, maybe if I can ask when, and I'll start with Erin, when it is acceptable to make those changes, how you make those changes.
My book is called Smashing Statues, which, by the way, was my working title. I was like, this is like snakes on a plane, It'll get the idea across to my publisher, but then they're like, no, keep it. But it's sort of a misnomer because I made a very dorky spreadsheet of all of the statues that left their pedestals that I could find, and the tiniest minority of a real handful were taken down unofficially by protesters, not on sort of governmental official orders. And of those, I think 3 or 4 were irrevocably damaged. All the rest of them were either given back to the private donors, the United Daughters of the Confederacy or Sons of Confederate Veterans, that kind of thing. A lot of those have gone re-up on private land, but often very visible private lands. A few sculptures of monuments have gone into museums, but really most of them are in storage in what I still cannot believe the New York Times allowed me to call in print America's Strategic Racism Reserve. But a number of those have gone back on display fairly recently. So it's not that this problem is over, they're still around.
Anoush?
Yeah, so thinking about destroying monuments and when are monuments destroyed, when I was thinking about, in my field site, in my little corner of the world, what is destroyed, when is it destroyed, how is it destroyed, and specifically in terms of these Armenian churches and monasteries that I study, there was, they go through similarly different waves. There's kind of, like you mentioned, the sort of periodization of when monuments here have been torn down and contested. In Turkey also, it was, before 1915, these churches and monasteries were active, they were active religious sites. They weren't monuments in the sense of representing something else. They were active, parts of a religious community. And then after 1915, they were either abandoned or confiscated by the state, and then left basically to their own devices for about 40 years. In some cases, local Kurds or Turks took over and used them, used them as houses, as barns, etc. But in 1950, there was a moment when in Van, the local governor got the idea that somehow Armenians might try to come back and they might use these monuments as a way to lay claim to the land. And so we have to get rid of them. We have to get rid of these material, concrete, stone, public, visible representations that Armenians were here and lived here. And so he made a decree in 1950 to get rid of all of the monuments in his area, including, there were, probably 100 in that region. And so he tasked local villagers to go and tear them down. And they tore down most of them and built the local courthouse with them, the House of Justice, in sort of an ironic twist. But there was one specific church that they couldn't destroy. And this one, it was a 10th century monastery built by the Armenian king Gagik II, king of Vaspuragan, which was a kingdom in the area in the 10th century. And it's now a UNESCO World Heritage Site. It's an incredibly beautiful monastery with fresco carvings on the outside. But these local villagers, they were tasked to go there by boat because it's in an island in the Van Lake, and to use hammers and chisels to break down this stone monastery. And I interviewed one of the men who was tasked with going there and breaking down this church. He was a teenager at the time. When I interviewed him, he was in his 80s. And he said they went there in this boat and they climbed up on the top and they hammered away all day and they couldn't break a single stone. I mean, again, a little bit of mysticism here that the church is somehow magical, it's protecting itself. And they ran out of water eventually. So they gathered a couple of stones from the island and they thought, okay, we'll just tell the governor that we're working on it. And they took the boat back. But at the same time, by chance, there was a Kurdish journalist named Yashar Kemal who happened to be traveling in Van for another story, and he was on the boat with a military doctor. And the military doctor had seen what was going on, and he said, look, there's this incredible monument on this island, and the governor is having it torn down. It doesn't matter if this is an Armenian monument, this is a monument to humanity, and we have to save it. Can you do something? And so Yashar Kemal, this Kurdish journalist, he called his newspaper, they called someone in the Ministry of Culture and Tourism, they called the governor, and they managed to stop the destruction of this monastery, while all of the other monasteries in the region had already been torn down, other 5th century, 6th century monuments. And so this church was saved. And again, it just sat there for another 50 years, crumbling, but not destroyed. And in 2007, while Turkey and Armenia were sort of having a little bit of a moment of rapprochement, which didn't go anywhere, unfortunately, and Turkey wanted to be a part of the EU at the time, they used this monument as a way to show that they were friendly to their minorities, that they were into multiculturalism. And so they got some EU funds, and the Turkish government restored the monument, the church, not as a church, but as a museum under the control of the Ministry of Culture and Tourism. And so if you go there now, you can go with your little museum card that you can get into all the museums in Turkey. And there's signage about the art and about when it was built, but no mention of Armenians, the Armenian history, the fact that this was one of the major religious centers for hundreds of years. No mention of the genocide, no mention of the destruction of Armenians. And there's Armenians inscriptions all over the island, on the church, on tombstones. There's no translation, there's no understanding. And so it's been turned into this sort of art object. And again, it's a UNESCO World Heritage Site. So there are tourists who come here from all over the world. But it's been totally denuded of that history. It's been totally whitewashed and depoliticized.
Who do they say built it?
They say the name of the king, but nothing about that he was Armenian. It was built by King Gagik II in 951. End of story.
Let me go to some of the questions that we've gotten. And two of them I'll talk about for a moment. One says, why is the Wallenberg monument in front of the Taubman Architecture School never mentioned at events or publications? I will mention then. There's actually 2 monuments on campus of Raoul Wallenberg, one in the Taubman Architecture School where Raoul Wallenberg was a student here between 1931 and 1935. There's also another monument just to the east of the Rackham building, which is interesting. The one just to the east of the Rackham building was built on the site of what they believe was an old Jewish cemetery. So it's also interesting in that that's a way of repurposing a site and repurposing location. It relates to the palimpsest idea. For those of you who may not know, Raoul Wallenberg was a student at the University of Michigan between 1931 and 1935, and subsequently went on through the War Refugee Board in the United States to be stationed in Budapest and save tens of thousands of Hungarian Jews during the Holocaust. So he is the person we've named the Raoul Wallenberg Institute after in order to promote his values of empathy, tolerance, courage, and leadership. I'll say also, while I'm on the topic of Raoul Wallenberg, the house that he happened to live in was about to be torn down just a few blocks away from here, was about to be torn down because of the new dormitory they're building. And when the university realized that they were going to tear down the house that Raoul Wallenberg happened to have lived in for 2 years, they decided that they were going to preserve the house, and they physically relocated it, lifted up the house, moved it 2 blocks, and now it's sitting in the corner of Division and Jefferson in what used to be a service parking lot, right next to the house that belonged to Arthur Miller, which used to be down by where the Gandhi Dancer is, and they picked that up several years ago and moved it also in the same service parking lot. And we at the Raoul Wallenberg Institute are hoping to move in to those buildings in the next few years once they do very significant renovations to them. So also just kind of the importance of monuments, the repurposing of it, thinking this house in particular, Wallenberg just rented a room in there for 2 years in 1931 and 32, but yet it's been given this importance, such importance that the university thought it worthwhile to move it a few blocks. And again, repurposing the Jewish cemetery. So that kind of gets to the other question, which is about location, the meaning of location of monuments. And I'll ask that question also with just kind of a memory of my own. When I first went to Charleston, I remember going with a friend who showed me that there's a memorial to the Holocaust in the center of Charleston, in the shadow of where the John Calhoun statue was. And he pointed out the irony of having this memorial to tolerance and to mutual understanding right literally in the shadow underneath, across the street from this towering statue of John Calhoun. So maybe we can talk a little bit about the location of memorials and what the meaning of that is. So I'll turn things to Erin.
Yeah, so how much more time do we have left? Because I could talk about that forever. Because I think, to me, you need to understand a monument by its community. And so different locations have vastly different uses and futures, I think. So very reasonably, one focus of recent monumental change has been on monuments in front of government buildings, in the centers of towns, especially on courthouse lawns. So one of the most frequent spots in which you would find statues of anonymous Confederate low-ranking soldiers was on right in front of the entrance to the courthouse, because that kind of sends a message if you are someone being tried or trying to obtain justice in the courthouse, who that justice is for. Maybe not as much of a message as building the courthouse out of the stolen stones of people you have displaced, but still pretty close. So, for example, one of the first monuments to come down in Virginia was on the Charlottesville courthouse had a Johnny Reb statue. So not only did the activists working to remove that want that out, but they wanted a new monument instead. So they worked with the Equal Justice Initiative, and now there's a historical marker, a plaque describing the lynching of a man who was accused of a crime on very thin, just an accusation, was lynched, and they wanted to make the history of the courthouse clear. I think that monuments on university campuses are incredibly fascinating because most of monuments in city centers, nobody spends a second looking at. We're really just walking past, but many students will have traditions about monuments on campus. You know, you go and you rub George Washington's butt for luck before exams or whatever. And then having debates about should that monument be there or not, whose traditions, whose meaning is more relevant is fascinating. You know, I teach at the John Jay College of Criminal Justice, and so I will ask my students often, you know, hey, John Jay was a slaveholder. What do we think about that? There's a statue of him in the lobby of the building, and they don't care at all. They're like, how much would it cost to take it down? If it's more than like $100, nope, we don't care. We'd have to rebrand. That wouldn't be worth it because why? Because they know that they are not inferior to some white dude, so they don't need to prove it to themselves, so it doesn't matter. So I think that makes sense to me there, but on a courthouse lawn, a statue of like Calhoun is a very different meaning, I think.
Yeah, thinking about location and monuments, and this comes back to the question you asked earlier about palimpsest, which is a concept I use in my work to think about the layers of both materiality on the landscape, as well as violence, as well as memory, and what layers come together in certain histories. So when I was thinking about this event, I was thinking, is there any memorial in Turkey about the Armenian genocide? I know there's lots of, most of the memorials and monuments are built by the government. It's a very, strong central government with a strong sense of what narrative they want to be told, and they're happy to, put monuments everywhere that tell that story. But are there any other monuments? And it turns out, I actually didn't know about this. There was a monument built to memorialize the victims of the Armenian genocide by the Armenian community in Istanbul in the interwar years. In 1919, in the center of the city in Taksim, in the Pangalta Armenian cemetery. Then, when the Kemalist forces came and took over the city and the Republic of Turkey was founded, that memorial was taken down and disappeared. So we don't know what happened after the 20s. It was also it was pretty mild. It was a widow sort of crying, shrouded, and in a cemetery, so like amongst tombstones. But that specific location is interesting because the Pangalta Armenian cemetery was later razed, and it was the space where they created Taksim Square and the Gezi Park, which some of you may have heard of. In 2013, there were protests in Gezi Park when the government and Tayyip Erdogan, the now president, wanted to turn the park into a shopping mall, like a Ottoman-style barracks/shopping mall. And so there were protests that went on for a long time, and the protesters were successful in keeping the park and not having it turned into a shopping mall. But it also was a turning point in which Turkey, which seemed to be going in a democratic direction, turned, and since that was sort of the moment of the beginning of the descent into authoritarianism. And there were Armenian students, young people who were part of the protests, who had they were camping out in the park. They had a cutout gravestone in which they wrote in Turkish and Armenian and English, "You took our graveyard, you can't take our park." And so they were marking the fact that this space, which now is it's a public space in the middle of Istanbul, had been an Armenian cemetery that was appropriated and had held this memorial to the Armenian genocide. And now it's a public park, but also just adjacent to it in Taksim Square, there is a huge monument to Kemal Atatürk, who was the founder of the Republic of Turkey. And that, Atatürk, is the most ubiquitous monument statue in Turkey. Anywhere you go, any school, all schools, any government building has a statue of Atatürk in front of it in town squares. He's everywhere. And it actually is a crime. There's a specific law that criminalizes any kind of damaging of any Atatürk statue, or so you're legally mandated to respect his likenesses.
Well, we now have laws, like in Alabama, against taking down statues that are, more than 40 years old? Is that the law? There's another question about names. There's actually a few questions maybe I'll draw from, but one about names and how we name spaces. And I can thinking of Charleston, and there's the plantations there, right? Magnolia Plantation, beautiful plantation where people sometimes have weddings and things like that. And I remember going to a talk once where the speaker advocated changing the names of these plantations to calling them slave labor camps, and to see what would happen then, and would people still want to have weddings at them if we call them by a different name and by the purpose they were actually used for. Makes me think of the significance of the name of the space. There's another question, since we're running a little bit low on time. Maybe Eleanor, if you want to walk around one more time, see if people have more questions. But another question about what if the monument is a space, a park, for example, that you can't get rid of it, but what should be imagined for the space? How can we deal with different spaces? The question also asked about the US-Mexican border wall, if that can be considered a monument. And I'll add to that just to think about the ways that spaces become monuments. I think, the Mexico border wall, probably not a monument now, but I could see it becoming a monument at some point in time in the perhaps very distant future. So maybe that's a few questions to get going on, Erin.
On names, I just want to say one of the most encouraging things I've heard in recent years is that residents are starting to petition for the change of street names because houses on streets named after like Lee or Forrest or big Confederate folks sell for appreciably less than houses in the neighborhood on a white supremacist name. So I think maybe just capitalism will get us out of that, perhaps, fingers crossed. There are a lot of parks or public spaces, dedicated to somebody. I think those are often not really in what our conception of a monument is, at least in America. In America, I think our monuments are putting somebody as a role model for what it looks like to be honored, who we want to aspire to be. And that is usually some dude on a horse. And when that dude comes down, a lot of the resulting discussion is often, well, who's the next person to put up on the horse? And I think it's time. We've had enough horses. We can have parks, we can have fountains, we can have playgrounds, we can have hospitals. We don't have to have just one body as a role model, because that's not going to always look like everybody. It's not going to inspire everybody. We have abstract monuments. We have personification. Like, we can do this. We can be creative. One of my favorite recent artworks about the topics of monuments is a work called The Commons by an artist, Paul Ramirez, where it's looks like a dude on a horse, but it's made out of corkboard. And he displays it with a bunch of little pieces of paper and pins. So the idea is you write your own message on it and then stick it up to this horse, so everybody can debate about what the meaning of that monument should be. So yes, please, let's be more creative.
Maybe I'll just add, it's interesting when you think about the controversy over naming, that we have monuments to many of our presidents, and one of them, that was used not just a person on a horse, not just a statue of a figure, was the Kennedy Center for the Arts, that had as its purpose something beyond just a statue of Kennedy. And I wonder if that's what made it easier to manipulate and to change the name of, because people don't think of it as solely a monument to the president. And I don't know what impact that has. It's not necessarily a question. Anoush, do you want to respond to any of those here?
Yes. I'm thinking of names and parks, and they relate. So in Eastern Turkey, I think names are one of the most politicized ways to look through the contest of who's in charge, who owns the land, who owns the memory, who owns the history. Because 100 years ago, again, the Ottoman Empire was a multi-religious, multi-ethnic, multi-linguistic space in which many of these villages and towns had been, around for hundreds, if not thousands of years, and they were named, by the local people who lived there. And so in Van, lots of villages had Armenian names, Kurdish names, Assyrian names, and very few Turkish names. And then after the Republic of Turkey was founded, starting in the 20s and then 30s, 50s, 70s, there were various waves of name changes, coming from the central government, in which almost all of the non-Turkish names were officially changed to Turkish names. And so you have these old maps and new maps that don't match at all. And it makes it very hard to find places because the people who live there still use the old names. And so when you ask, well, where is this place? They'll tell you the name of a village that you can't find on any maps. And so, they exist in the public memory, but not on the official map. So you have these kind of, again, layers of memories and names. But as part of the Kurdish movement's attempt to confront and contest this homogenizing view of history, they tried, while I was doing fieldwork, so between 2010, 2015, to resurrect those old names. And so in some of these old villages, like the village that I spoke about before, Khorkom, where Arshil Gorky was born, they put up signs with the Turkish name and the older name, the Armenian Kurdish names. And at the front of the entry to the village, in the Kurdish national colors, green, red, and yellow, which is very provocative to the Turkish government, and they put these up all over Van. So every village had the official Turkish government sign, and then the local Kurdish municipalities sort of like pirate sign, or this sign that isn't really supposed to be there, and bringing back these names onto the landscape that had never gone away. They've never been forgotten. They're always still used. Some people don't even know the official names of their towns or villages. And they also put up signs saying at the entry and exit of the cities, welcome to Van, in Armenian, Kurdish, Turkish, and English. So they're trying to bring back not only Kurdish, their own language, but also Armenian, the language of the people who were destroyed 100 years ago. And so it's a very clear political project. And then, again, after 2016, after the coup, when these government appointees were sort of helicoptered in and put in the place of the Kurdish mayors who had been, on the large part, arrested and imprisoned, all of those Kurdish and Armenian signs were taken down, and new, Turkish national signs in the Turkish national colors, white and red, were put up, in addition to Turkish flags like blanketing the cities. And not only that, but also on the mountainside. So this part of Turkey, the Kurdistan part of Turkey, is a very mountainous region, and there's lots of opportunity to use these mountainsides as sort of a tableau for whatever message you'd like to give. And the only people who have access to this, of course, is the Turkish military, because they're military spaces, and they usually have guard posts or watchtowers on them. And so they'll write on the mountainside in white chalk or white paint or red paint, either a giant Turkish flag or a Turkish crescent, moon, and star, which is what's on the flag, or nationalist sayings such as, there's a huge mountain overlooking the city of Van, and on the side of the mountain, there's the saying, "Happy is he who says he is a Turk." And this is over the city of, 1 million Kurds. On the mountain looking out towards Ahtamar, that church that I spoke about earlier, the 10th century Armenian cathedral, if you're a tourist and you go there and you take the ferry from the land side to the island, as you're looking back towards the land, there's a mountain with a Turkish flag on it, and it says, "The homeland will not be divided," which is a direct statement against the Kurdish separatists who are seeking some kind of autonomy. And so they have these, strategically placed messages to say, we're in charge. Turkey is the sovereign here. And so that's how they mark those spaces.
Let me return to a few other questions for maybe one final round here. And one of them is, what can we learn from ISIS's destruction of monuments in territories they controlled? Are there lessons or warnings that inform discussions in the US context? ISIS, the Islamic State, or the Taliban for that matter, that destroyed ancient statues. And I'll kind of expand on that question and say, I wonder if the age of the monuments makes it more difficult or makes it more disturbing for some when it's destroyed. I think there weren't really all that many outcries when the Black Lives Monument, Black Lives Matter monument, or Black Lives Matter Square in Washington, D.C. was painted over. That was a monument, I suppose, that had been a few years old, but yet was easier to take down than many of these Confederate statues have been. Then also there's questions about the distinction between monuments, memorials, and museums. And if we see a major distinction, what the difference between them is. Another question, who gets to decide which monuments stand, which monuments stay? I guess we could also say who gets to decide which monuments to take down, who should be making those decisions. And then one other question that I'll ask is, can you speak to the distinction between masculine and feminine monuments, by which maybe monuments of men versus monuments of women, how they're treated differently, what the differences between them would be. So I don't know, you can take any of those questions in any order, but just trying to get through a bunch of these. So, Erin?
Well, to me, a monument is a goal for the future, what we want to encourage people to be, and a memorial is a reminder of something we want never to happen again. But it gets tricky because a lot of Confederate statues are called memorials and are sort of explained as, oh, this is about the tragedy of the Civil War. And it's like, no, that's actually a victory monument, my friend. This is put up only after Jim Crow laws go into effect. This is his celebration. Who gets to decide, I think, is close to this question of the Islamic State and destruction. So when the Islamic State was blowing up ancient Greek and ancient Near East Syrian temples and palaces, et cetera, I wrote decrying destruction. And so then when I'm writing about American monuments, some people are like, oh, now you're pro-destruction, hypocrite. But to me, it's exactly the same. Is there a faction who are using their power or threats to impose something on the population, whether that's imposing a monument that the population doesn't want, or forcing the destruction of a monument that the population does want. And I don't like that in either case. So, for example, when the Islamic State blew up temples at Palmyra, an important archaeological site in Syria, that has made the peace process so much harder because that was a major tourist site. A large percentage of the population made their money from the tourists who came to visit those temples. So they didn't want them gone. There was not a democratic process. And the Birmingham monument, the population of Birmingham became majority black in the 70s. So for many, many decades, the population of the city was trying to get this Confederate monument gone, but the state legislature would not allow them to do so. It was passing laws protecting the monument because they wanted to force Birmingham to have it. So I think those are both undemocratic uses of power. So you have to, I think public monuments should actually be public. We call them public, but that's just because they're forced upon people to look at. Very few of the monuments we have, it could be monuments you disagree with, it could be monuments that you like, but the public usually had very little role in choosing that subject, deciding where to put them, because you have to be powerful enough to assure a place in public and rich enough to pay for a monument. And so I think that should really change in America, would be nice.
Erin, let me ask you a follow-up. Can you think of any American monuments that actually are true public monuments that were put up by the public as in a democratic fashion?
I'm generally grumpy, so that would be, calling to mind good things. So I will probably think of one in about 30 seconds, but I can't.
Anoush?
Yeah, I will jump off from there. So the aftermath of the ISIS destruction, the ISIS was destroyed as a collaboration between US forces and Kurdish forces on the ground in Syria and Iraq. And for the last, so many years since ISIS was contained, it's been the Kurdish forces of the SDF, the Syrian Democratic Forces, in northeastern Syria, also known as Rojava, which is it means east in Syria, and it's been controlled by Kurdish autonomous government in that area. And this group, it's related to the Kurdish movement in Turkey. They follow kind of a Marxist, eco-feminist, socialist political ideology. Their leader is Abdullah Öcalan, who is imprisoned currently in Turkey, but has this kind of like democratic confederalism, socialist idea. And as part of their feminist, the part of their ideology, in all levels of their leadership, from local neighborhood councils to mayors, to also in their military wings, they have a man and a woman on equal terms in charge. And so in the SDF, in the Syrian Democratic Forces, they have the men's fighters, the YPG, and the women's fighting groups, the YPJ. And they were instrumental in the defeat of ISIS and subsequently in the containment of, I think 8,000 ISIS fighters in prisons in northeast Syria. And in some of these places where they've been in charge, they've put up statues, monuments to fallen Kurdish fighters who lost their lives in the fight against ISIS. And some of them are of women. And so there are these statues of Kurdish women fighters, usually with long hair or braids, because they usually would braid their hair and wear sort of a notable scarf, and in public. And recently, in the last, I think, month, in early January, the Syrian central government forces, now with the support of the US, has retaken some of those areas. So the US has shifted its support from the Kurdish group to the Syrian government. And when some of these Syrian central government forces retook some of these cities that the Kurdish forces had been in charge of, they tore down one of these statues of a Kurdish woman. And so there's videos on YouTube of these Syrian government forces pulling down this statue of a Syrian woman, a Kurdish woman fighter. And this comes to the issue of feminine, female and male statues, because that was very threatening to some interpretations of what women's roles should be. So women, with arms, were very threatening to some groups. Some of these Syrian government forces also, in battles with these Kurdish fighters, they killed some of them, including women fighters. And there's another video that sparked a lot of outrage recently in the last 2 weeks, of a Syrian government fighter holding a braid from a killed Kurdish woman fighter. And he walks into a shop and says, this is a braid of a heval, which means a comrade in Kurdish. And that's what they call themselves, and they're being called. And the other person in the video says, well, what happened to her? And he says, she's already dead. So this video, it went viral, and it became a source of an inspiration for resistance all over Kurdistan. So all over the 4 parts of Kurdistan, including as well as the US and Europe, women, Kurdish women and others have staged braiding protests in which they stand in a line, they'll braid each other's hair as a way to show solidarity. And in Suleimania in Iraq, in the Kurdistan region in Iraq, the mayor of Suleimania is now planning a braid monument. So I just saw a photo of it. It's not built yet, but it's in the Kurdish colors, sort of braided material in red, green, and yellow, with a flower sort of representing resistance and the power of the Kurdish struggle. And so, yeah, this comes back to the question of male and female.
Just thanks.
But one more thing to add on that, a nonprofit called the Monument Lab did a monument survey a few years ago of public art in the U.S. And found something like there are more public monuments to mermaids than there are to congresswomen. So it's a pretty dire in terms of the gender balance of American monuments.
Yeah, and I saw actually, I think you wrote about the monuments in Central Park, that most of them are to fictional women. Yeah, and just in the 5 minutes remaining, maybe I'll give you both an opportunity to give some soundbite final words. So on the question of why do monuments matter?
I think that's up to you. And this type of question is why I love speaking at universities, because the experts have no idea of what to do. Everyone is asking, what should we do about monuments? And this is the time to make your voices heard, because we don't know. We are inventing the wheel as we're driving this American bus, or some mixed metaphor like that. So I think that everyone should make their voices heard about the future of our nation in general, but the future of our monumental landscape as well. So who do you want to see up on the horse, or do you have any non-horse ideas? Please have non-horse ideas.
Yeah, so I'll try to leave us on a hopeful note, which is that even though monuments seem concrete and seem static, there are opportunities for reinterpretation or subversion of those monuments. And again, thinking back to my field site of Vaughan, the majority of monuments in Vaughan are actually random apolitical things. Like there's a giant Vaughan cat, a white cat with a blue and yellow eye. There's a giant statue of Vaughan fish that live in the lake. They're just like little Vaughan symbols. There's a giant tea samovar with tea cups. So it's, things that are just, nice and not political and not an issue. But then if you sort of look past the main square, there are monuments that are super political and then monuments that are not monuments, but subvert the monuments. So in another city close to Vaughan, the government built a park, again coming back to parks, called the July 15th Martyrs Park. The martyrs killed during the coup of July 15th. And it's very nationalistic, it has Turkish flags. But on the road to get to that town, you have to go over a mountain pass, and the government recently built a new snow tunnel to go under the snow when it's very snowy in that time. And when I first went there a couple years ago to visit, I was shocked to see on the road in bright yellow paint, it was written Karapet Kartuneli, which means Karapet Snow Tunnel. So the snow tunnel is named Karapet. And Karapet is 100% an Armenian name. I mean, nobody else uses this name except for Armenians. And I'm shocked. Like, why would the government, highway patrol name this road after an Armenian? And I asked some locals who I spoke with, I said, why? And they said, well, we always called that mountain pass the Karapet Mountain Pass because we know that there was an Armenian named Karapet who lived there a long time ago. But the government doesn't know that. They just think that Karapet Kartuneli sounds good because kar means snow in Turkish. They should have named it Mehmet Snow Tunnel or Ahmet Snow Tunnel, but they don't know better, so they named it Karapet Snow Tunnel. And I thought this was such an amazing example of the power and the perseverance and the stubbornness of memory, even when the government wants to rewrite it and erase those local histories with their own narrative, that those memories and those alternative histories, they stick around.
Thank you. And please join me in thanking Erin Thompson, Anoush Tamar Suni. Thank you all. Thank you all. And our next dialogue, by the way, is March 10th, I believe, with Pam Nadell and Deborah Dashmore on the topic of Is American Anti-Semitism Exceptional? So I hope to see you all March 10th. And again, thank you, everybody. Thank you. That was great.